IVM.
This is Audio Gyan, and I am your host Kedar Nimkar. Welcome to a deep dive into the minds of luminaries from the Indian creative world. Today we have Mohor Ray with us on Audio Gyan. Mohor is a co-founder of Co-Design, an independent brand identity design practice. She served as a jury member at DNED Awards, and she's active in writing about people, culture, design, and branding. Mohor is also an editor of Dekho, an award-winning anthology of inspirational conversations with designers in India, which we'll soon jump into in the end of the conversation. It's also one of the self-initiated projects by Mohor and Co-Design. Obviously, they have done the Unbox Festival and the Project Rising, which we'll briefly touch upon. You'll find all the links in the show notes. And today we are here to discuss about building branding systems. So thanks, Mohor, for giving your time. And it's a real pleasure to have you on Audio Gyan.
Thanks, Kedar. It's exciting to be here.
Awesome. So I've kept the name as templates are dead, but because that's one of the question, but it's mainly to understand sort of your perspective and your understanding of what are brands, how have you built branding systems and so on and so forth. To begin with, I'll ask you the most basic question, which is sort of what according to you is brand. You can go philosophical, abstract, however, and also to follow up, how has that definition changed over time? And this is a very classic question I keep asking about what's the definition and how has it changed over time?
Sure. So I'm going to actually, take these two questions in the reverse order, because I think when I come to, what my understanding of brand is today, it's also, I think, the result of the journey, with the practice, right, which being co-design. So when we started, and this is, of course, late 2004, 2005, as a young practice, no one's really going to entrust you. And in those days, it was still called corporate identity, right? So no one was going to trust, really sort of, almost graduates, these, nobody sort of knows you. And you start, essentially like any other sort of, small design, graphic design studio starting up with a lot of brand communication projects, right? So which is a mix of, you're doing environmental graphics one day, an installation or a publication, so on and so forth. But again, mostly for brands. So that's where I think my work with brands started. And I think as one started working with these, and if you think of these are essentially your end touch points, right, of a brand. That's where a person eventually sort of experiences the brand. So it's a very, very tangible form of the brand. So I think as one sort of kept working with them, I think I started questioning कि ये क्या है, if for instance a particular brand is doing a book, a publication, or a space, what is the way that they view it, right? What is the way they think of it? So I think even at that point where it was very, very sort of tangible output based, I think within I naturally sort of gravitated to thinking about it from the brand's perspective. And at some point also feeling the limitation with, ye jo ingredients hain, right, which were at that point really given out as these very traditional corporate identity guidelines, one started finding them a little bit limiting. And, somewhere kept questioning, how would I do it, right, if I had the opportunity? And I think slowly, somehow, then the sort of effort to start doing more brand identity projects started, right? So eventually that move from doing these output-based projects moved on to brand identity projects. So these were interesting because, you suddenly started looking at this system as almost like a scaffolding, right? So that you were
sorry to interrupt, but like when you mentioned when these are sort of the touch points for a brand.
Yeah.
So if I have to take it like a little abstract, is like how would you sort of like define that? I mean, is it a chicken and egg story or is it like very linear in form, as in you have a name and the moment that name has certain values attached to it, it becomes a brand? Or you know what I mean, right? Like a bit more abstract in a sense, how does a brand come to be also?
Yeah. So I'm just coming to that. So I'm going to actually follow that story in the reverse order. which is what I said,
Okay.
because that's actually personally been like how the understanding built up from actually what eventually goes out into the world, all the way back to a slightly more philosophical or abstract sense.
Sure.
From this sort of, very, very tangible, specific sort of output point of view, the practice, moved into this identity system mode where we were setting up the foundation, some sort of a scaffolding. Now, while we were doing this, over the years, what happened is one started questioning ki ye aisa kyun bana rahe hain? Why are we creating this system like this? Which I think eventually pushed the practice to where it is today, which is, I think, a much more sort of strategic space where you're constantly trying to find and refine the intent of why a brand exists in the world, right? Because it was really sort of a reverse thing, because we were, I think also India at that point was, I think branding as such was still a very, very nascent industry, right? And I think that's why we sort of worked our way backwards up from this sort of very specific output oriented mode to the sort of, the bare bones, the structure of it, all the way to philosophically saying, okay, why does it exist? Why does a brand exist? And if we crack that, then that sort of point of view trickles down very, very strongly and steadily through rest of the system, all the way down to the final touch point. So that was, I think, where this sort of definition of where I am today, right? So if you ask me today, and again, right, this might change based on, I think, how the practice runs for the next 2-3 years. But I think where I'm today is, I think it's essentially, it is abstract. It is essentially mind space. Right. It's literally a part of, it's a set of associations, emotions, etc. But I think what's important to maybe point out here is the fact that when I say mind space, it's both, everyone understands what an external mind space is, right? What a consumer facing or user facing sort of mind space is. But along with that, it's also the internal mind space, right? And that is, whether you're the founder all the way down to all the sort of employees and team. So when you think about the brand in the external mind space thing, right? So it's not so much about what you as a brand stakeholder say, these are our values, visions, but it's really how the audience remembers you, right? How do they think about you and what is it that they associate with you? And very, very importantly, today in a world where, everyone has a voice and a platform, is how do they talk about you? So, and this is where we are seeing a huge shift, right? From thinking in the context of branding, right? From thinking about the audience as the receiving end of the brand, right? As a concept, we've told them our vision and vision. We've told them our ideas and values. And that is what is it, right? That is what they will receive. But I think, now when we think about consumers or our users, we think of them as communities. We think of them as much more sort of active participants. They're also building the brand with us, right? So, and that is whether they become brand ambassadors, whether they become, and when I say brand ambassadors, I'm not saying these are sort of paid influencers or whatever. These are just, genuinely sometimes you find people really sort of connect with a brand. And then they will constantly be convincing people around them to switch as well, right? So this is where, the value system sort of shifts just from you as an organization to something that is actually also owned by me as a user, right? So I can be a loyalist and at the same time, I can also be a critic. And that also sort of feeds back into that idea of the mind space, right? The brand mind space.
So there are these 3 categories, right? Early adopters and then laggards, and there is one more type of segment in the middle. And what they call, I think in the marketing terminology or some terminology, they call it like the crossing the chasm. So there is this small window where the system tips and eventually everyone has a smartphone because QRT phones or feature phones are no longer there in the market itself. So that's what I'm saying. The early adopters or the people who swear by a particular brand, people who stand outside Apple for 2 to 3 days, that piece of audience, is it increasing in the pie or is increasing in the share? Is that pointing it to that thing?
I think, I also think, it's a very clear definition or a philosophy, but I think it's a little bit blurry at the moment because what I think increasingly in our work, with sort of, we work across very, very different consumer segments, right? And I think what we are finding is a lot of these slightly more traditional definitions, are constantly now being challenged. A lot of those boundaries and silos are often sort of blurring. You find the same person, being a very different consumer across different times of the day. As they sort of grow older, some of them actually grow younger in their choices. So I think I'm very, to be really honest, I'm very, very wary of sometimes, a slightly more generalized understanding of users, especially. And I think that context really is everything, right? And it helps you understand. But also, I think going back to, brand and, if this is sort of the new space where we are seeing, where we sort of need to shift how we think about users as also people who are building this. I think internally, also that idea of the brand is, this how you think and how therefore you act. Who do you see as an ally? What in the world do you really want to sort of rebel against or defeat or change? What are the choices that you make? And also, I think very importantly today, what are the choices that you don't make? Right? We always talk about what do brands stand for, but I think at some point, it also becomes important to also decide, what is it that I'm not going to stand with? And I think essentially, therefore, today when someone says, that you're designing brands, what you're really trying to do is to, create and capture a mind space, right? And again, both, something that is as compelling, as sticky to build sort of internal, and I would call them communities and not even teams anymore. And, communities with sort of your users and consumers. I think that's really the big goal. So it's essentially mind space.
Interesting. I think we'll come to this because I have like a follow-up question on this.
Sure.
But yeah, so I wanted to borrow like Steve Jobs' word where he said it's a noisy world, and he said that probably in when he was relaunching or when he had rejoined Apple. So keeping that as the premise, I generally think it's a very, very noisy world. And especially today where almost every brand is trying to make its space or trying to create content or try to, of course, my worldview is very limited to the digital products, but you can explore that further. So what do you think is more powerful when you are creating sort of the identity along with its values and the whole package around it, which probably we can just, for like a lack of a better word, design system or a branding system? Is that, like, if it's really done well, is that becomes powerful? Or in today's day and age, media buying takes the brand forward because you need to be present in so many spaces? So how do you look at these two things? Like, do you have a comparison in your mind, or they are not interconnected, or whatever? Like, whatever.
So
I just wanted to.
So I mean, I have 2-3 different sort of ways of looking at this, right? So if I were to start with, I think, the first thing that I would question is, why should we even be pitting these decisions of, should I spend more time creating this identity and this values, this identity piece, or should I, be spending my resources on media? I think to be really honest, where you sort of see this sort of rift coming is really because there is a specified allocated budget, and then everyone's sort of fighting with, what to spend it on. But
no, sorry.
Yeah.
No. So I think the drift is slightly different.
Okay.
Say like in probably 20 years ago, you had limited brands like Bajaj and Chetak and say, I don't know, maybe Fevicol. But since the media was very controlled, it was still not as fragmented as we have today. That's why those narratives still stay in our mind, or it was not noisy. That's
Got
why they
it.
stayed. That's sort of the premise which I'm trying to.
All right.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. I think without the right intent, I think both are as useful or useless, right? Because I think the right media is, a lot more impactful than necessarily a lot of media, right? Because what happens is, if you buy up a lot of media, but that is not something that's relevant to the particular target audience or the context that you're operating in, you'll splash a lot of billboards, but the right people aren't seeing it, or the billboard isn't even the right sort of context. So I think the problem with a lot of the media buying, and sometimes why, I think people, clients especially, end up feeling cheated, is because maybe, the right allocation did not happen to the right things. Secondly, the other thing is one can sort of always buy up a lot of, prime media visibility. But at the end of the day, if your design and content is undifferentiated, or if it's misleading, at worst, you might raise some eyebrows and, get some people just sort of acquainted with it. But I think one has to remember that design is going to be the longer running thread through all the brand experiences, right? Because I think when we think of media buying, right, and mostly it's really in the context of acquisition that we think that, more people need to know, or people need to know that we are changing to something, or that, we've got some new stuff going. But the thing is, eventually when people have landed up at your doorstep, right, what happens to the experience then, right? And therefore I think, and again, this might obviously, be biased, I might be a little bit more biased, but I think the investment in design is also the longer running thread. I think while the noisiness of the media landscape is scary, the thing is, I think we're all in a little bit of a rush, which I don't think really helps anybody. Brand building recall, building associations takes time. I'm sure, the average person today is looking at, and we don't even realize it, right? Sometimes that we're, I think, probably consuming about 100 different pieces of branded content in a day without realizing it, right? So recall takes time. And that's why, even though, and which is going to be funny, because I know a lot of this conversation, we are actually going to talk about things that change and things that are flexible. But a certain consistency of thought or intention actually becomes very, very critical for things to even, register with people. It takes time to register. I think what we do is we mistake a sensation sometimes for having, being able to sort of successfully create a mind space. I think people's lives, are very, very busy. There are many things to worry about. And therefore, again, right, I think it's, instead of a lot of media, if you look at the right media, for your audience, if you, instead of looking at design that is sort of very, very catchy, is it meaningful in that context? I think those are more important things. The thing,
No, so then suppose if we design a really good, say a campaign or a product or a service or something which is sort of, I'm just flipping the question slightly differently. So assume we build something really cool, which has sort of some substance to it. Now it could be anything. Now, will it need a sponsored post? Because you're constantly looking like bunch of posts and following a lot of people on Instagram. So it's inevitable, right, to have a sponsored post. But especially like let's take Audiogan for example. I've been doing some like reflection on where am I doing, what am I doing, and what has been done so far. And there is really good gems that I have, but I've never posted anything or actively bought in media or like did some ad campaigns or anything. So it's pretty much static. The growth is pretty much static. Now that's where I'm coming from, is that do you need to buy a media despite having a good content or good substance to the brand itself?
I think buying media is, I think, in my opinion, again, not the only answer, right? I think there is also, for instance, if we take the case of Audiogan, right? I think in the case of Audiogan, for instance, one could look at engaging and building the community more strongly, and that sort of in turn becoming, the channel through which it grows, right? Because I think there is, even today, even if I see, let's say, a skincare product, it is quite likely that, I end up clicking on a sponsored post and I see, somebody else who's also used it. I am, it is quite likely that at some point, I will ask this person that, hey, this is a brand new thing. Have you tried it? And I think that power of people being connected with people and these ideas sort of passing via them is actually going to be very, very important, right? So I think a sponsored post might get visibility, but I don't have any data to right now say that this will also result in a richer engagement with that product.
Beautiful. I think I got my answer. Yeah. Very nicely put. Yeah. Cool. You also, I was reading some of your articles, and one of the articles had a nice title saying templates are dead. I wanted to just double click on that, and how do you ensure sort of brands that, because I'm a designer and want to be creative but also want scale. So I have to find the right templates at a very
Yeah,
tactical level also, and at a bit abstract level also. You want to just give us more in
absolutely.
like
Yes.
nuances about it?
So I think
Yeah.
first, I think I should clarify for everybody what I mean when I say, templates are dead. I think again, and in that specific article as well, I think it refers to a certain kind of template that I think is dead. And that is essentially, the very sort of traditional, immovable, so sacrosanct that you can't touch it, that idea of templates. And again, please remember, this is coming from the identity space, right? So my grudge with them is essentially that these kind of templates, no, they're very, very specific to what we know are today's formats, right? But we also understand that, formats and the kinds of engagement are constantly changing. I think in an earlier conversation with you, I think I'd, talked about how, we'd all laugh at our dads taking vertical videos all the time on their phones. And, look, no one's laughing now, right? Vertical videos are it, right? Most of us now are shooting, vertical videos. So I think, we have to be honest and admit that while we can all speculate and guess what the future is bringing, we will never completely know what it will bring. So therefore, that's one of my first reasons for being slightly annoyed with, templates which don't respond, which are just fixed in what we know today, right? And are not sort of built for change. My other general gripe with, traditional templates are they're almost designed as lorem ipsum, dummy text, dummy sab kuch, right? They don't somehow take into account the content or the context. Now, if, for a second, we think about a brand as a person, right? So, as a human being, you will have a certain value system and, a slightly specific personality. But, when you go to a wedding versus when you go to a funeral, you're not going to behave exactly the same way, right? While you will still remain Kedar. Kedar at a college reunion versus Kedar in his office at an appraisal meeting will be a different Kedar, right? But you're still Kedar. So now if I extend this back to identity systems, right? So templates that, are completely devoid of understanding what kind of content or context I have to deal with will always end up throwing up challenges where they're not appropriate in certain contexts. Sometimes brands need to be very loud. Sometimes they need to be slightly subtle. Sometimes they do need to be serious. Sometimes they need to do something more playful. But template hai, ab humko isi mein sab kuch karna hai, right? But I also agree that why we've come to templates, right? We've come to templates because we need larger numbers of people, of creators to sort of stay on brand. We want to remove individual or sort of selective subjectivity and make sure that, there is consistency across, let's say, the 10 million things a brand today puts out. So systems are important. But if we again go back to brands and say, okay, how do brands live today? And I think why I use the word live and I don't use the word exist. Exist is a dull word, ki hai, zinda hai. But to live really, means to be able to take on change, to be able to evolve, and to be able to react differently in different situations. So essentially, I think there is definitely a need for, systems and, not just for scale, but just to sustain sort of, engagement over time. But I think the systems definitely need to be built for change and for contextual change. So this has to be intelligent change. It's not change for the sake of change. We define rules, but I think when people don't understand why certain rules are there, no, and I'm referring to, the standard sort of brand Bible type of situation, people can faithfully sort of reproduce or clone, but, it doesn't really have life. They're not able to, as creative practitioners in the team, you also want them to be able to bring their strengths to the table, right? So I think, in my opinion, maybe, instead of calling it templates or whatever, maybe we call them, something like principles, right? Which is sort of a mix of guidelines, but with a very clear sort of articulation of what their role is, what their intention is. And I think that intelligence hai, and that intelligence has to be coded into all those basic ingredients. Why do we sort of think of colors as ye color fixed hai and this is fixed? But imagine, if you think of all these basic assets also of a brand identity, but you think of them how language is made, right? You think of all the different parts of speech, and then you can sort of put them together in different ways to perform different roles. So I think that's Yeah, that's where I'm coming from, where I'm saying that, systems are important, but I think dead, immovable templates are not. But I think something that's more principle based, along with the guidelines, where people understand the why of it and the personality of it and the character of it, I think they're able to build more things rather than, there was one identity project done in this year and then, now we have to live with it uh, until the system breaks. The system shouldn't break. It should be able to evolve.
Yeah, I'm very fascinated and want to understand this more, but let's take a short break. Yeah, we'll be right back. Okay, welcome back to the show. So, a bit technical question then, like, does it mean that your or does it have to be this way, which is your grammar for building that system can be more, does it need to be slightly tactical to address like today's need, or you build that grammar also at a very abstract level? So like this has been my like personal struggle also. If you make a logo or if you make a brand identity, can you build an underlying grammar which I can extrapolate and continue as a designer, because that's where the agency's job would probably stop and then the brand can or the product can own it.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's so what are your thoughts on that? Like, is it devoid of two things? A principle is separate, the grammar is separate, or it's a one unit, one system that
it's a layered system. And I'm just wondering right now if sort of diving into examples is maybe a good way to understand this before it gets even more abstract with my terrible metaphors. But so I think maybe, and these are of course also recent projects. I think PhonePe and MPL are sort of built on these sort of layered principles, where on these layered sort of view where it's principles plus guidelines. The end objective, in both these cases was essentially to set up a toolkit that other creatives could play with, right? And, be able to create new, completely context sensitive adaptations without losing the brand feel. So for both of these, if you consider this was the starting point. So if you look at PhonePe, right? So one of the most sort of visible and, versatile elements is that of this graphic element in there, it's called the beam. So in terms of its structure and form, it draws very simply from the circular mark that they have, that if it were to move, right, it would take on the path of the beam. Now, what you have here is almost a fixed graphic element, right, which is this form of, it's a slightly capsule-like form, which is sort of, stretches. But conceptually, what is it, right? Conceptually, the principle is that the idea of moving forward is always there. The idea of moving forward confidently, boldly, which, echoes the entire sort of brand message of collective progress, the whole sort of karte ja, badhte ja sort of feeling, right? Principally, that is the understanding that you have to build when you work with the fixed asset, which is the beam, right? Now, what happens when you sort of embed this in your handover to the design team and all the agencies that work with it, is that they understand that this is an element, but this is why it moves in a particular way. So when they build their renditions, right, they always understand that I might animate it to go in a loop. It might sort of fly like a flag, but there is a certain character to the movement. That quality of sort of boldness and sort of joyfulness remains intact. And which is why I think that goes down to the success of, it's been a year and a half. And, the PhonePe design team has continued to sort of build on it. And you feel, and we've seen so many sort of iterations of it, right? But I think having that sort of principle of what does this represent, what is the energy, and almost sort of building a, personality around it has really, really helped.
But यार इसमें ना मतलब थोड़ा सा unreal lag raha hai, because I've gone through the video, I've gone through the website and the kind of the system, and I'll tell you why I'm coming from like unreal. It's so natural, it's so beautifully done that it feels obvious. Now मतलब सच बताओ, is it like because creative होने के जैसे ना कभी कभी like it strikes, right, and it feels very instinctively this is the thing, or can it be really achieved through iterations? This is slightly detour, but yeah, wanted to
Sorry, what do you mean by iterations here, Kedar?
iterations as in like you are mulling on the idea continuously, you're trying variations and arrive at that output, or sometimes it just the execution is almost zero, but it's like the idea naturally fits in, it's almost like a serendipity. अरे ये तो yes चमक गया. Does it happen?
हाँ नहीं, आइडिया के बिना तो मुश्किल ही है आगे बढ़ना.
हाँ.
Because otherwise what, how do you, that idea of saying that what digital payments does is essentially, helps you move. That's the kind of liberation that it brings to your life, right? Because if you're not able to sort of bridge that sort of a brand idea or values into a slightly more tangible action. And I've realized, I think in our case, we're sort of predisposed to sort of always thinking of these things as almost, movement with some personality, right? Is why I think, once you sort of have the clarity of that, this is a certain kind of movement, right? And what is that kind of movement? So if I take the case of MPL, right? MPL is actually thoda sa or abstract, right? Where, the entire sort of family of brand assets is actually built on, I mean, I can talk about the assets specific, individually, but essentially there's one DNA that they all share, which is this crazy loud volume of thrill. So whether you now, dissect a piece of MPL creative into, the background elements, the color palette, the fonts, or the image treatment, or the animations, or the sonic identity, you'll realize there is a certain amount of volume and this sort of, little bit of this crazy energy, which is the world of gaming and which is really the internal DNA of MPL, right? And it's interesting because a lot of those things, right? There's the epicenter form. So like the PhonePe has the beam, there is this epicenter form, but that form is not limited to a shape. It's nothing. It's just a clever sort of gradation of three very intense colors, right? Which can adapt to literally any form factor. But it makes wherever you put it, right, behind things, in front of things, it immediately sort of gives it that larger than life vibe. One interesting thing which I think, people are never going to actually realize or articulate, but once the sonic identity of MPL was done, which is actually set at a higher beats per minute, so that, the moment you hear it, your heart starts to race, right? It's a natural instinct, right? All the motion design for MPL is actually also designed on the same rhythm, right? So what is interesting is when you have motion and sound together, your heart is racing. When you don't have sound also, right? Let's say you're just creating a simple GIF, right? 15 minutes hai, you have to put up something, right? Because there's some offer which is expiring, etc. You make a simple GIF, but that rhythm is the same. So, your feeling of that brand, whether it's visual or auditory, remains the same, right? So I think MPL is a great example for me of, that you can sort of go on to a higher level and say behavior kya hai? Are we able to in some way understand, create a behavior and then bring that to various elements of the brand? So the great thing about MPL, and which has been very helpful because, that's been a massively high growth brand. They've gotten into everything from esports to fantasy, etc., is that you have multiple assets, but because they share the same DNA, there is no pressure ki sab kuch ek saath use karna hai to make it feel MPL. Certain things will require quieter volume, so you can use, only one or two of the elements, but you still sort of don't lose that crazy thrilling edge of your seat sort of feel, that MPL has.
Interesting. I don't recollect the color exactly. I'm not the TG also, but I guess what happens is that even if you don't have movement, the vibrant color sort of gives you that feeling altogether.
Yeah. And everything is really, for me, the rhythm is what sort of cracked it.
Cool. Sounds interesting. I have like flooded with questions, but which could be probably offline and more of for me to understand. Can become a bit boring as well. So cool.
Yes, especially for people who have no context of all these elements we're talking about.
Yeah. Cool. So more, I wanted to actually have like last two questions. So in last 15 years of co-design, sort of working with such a wide range of clients, how do you sort of decide on a particular styling for a particular client? And this could be either aesthetics or, I mean, aesthetics comes last, actually. I understand that. So you can just touch upon it. But mainly, like in a nutshell, if you can give sort of the idea as to how do you engage with it, and then how do you abstract, because a lot of people like may not be able to tell what they want actually also. So how do you try and extract that information? Then I was also referring to one of the articles which you said, like, don't follow the trend, and
Yeah.
don't reject the trend as well. So I wanted to just like see if there is a connecting dot there and understand your point of view.
ठीक है. I know you said you don't really want to focus on aesthetics, but I am still going to sort of keep it in the play because I think it is important. Because what's happened is, especially honestly on a lot of platforms where we today talk and argue and discuss design, I think aesthetics has taken a little bit of a hit, where generally the entire sort of conceptual side of design or strategic side of design has taken a forefront, which is interesting because I feel like the time when we started my career it was all about aesthetics. Now but maybe these things move in cycles.
Yes.
So I actually would like to still keep aesthetics in play when we talk about this. How do you sort of decide a particular kind of style? Because I think it is important, because I think that's a place where we are generally as an industry not doing very well.
Absolutely.
Right. Or I think not creating.
Yeah. In fact, it resonates so much because
I'm really happy to actually talk aesthetics at this point, now that we've talked about a lot of very, very sort of top level things.
Yeah. No, in fact, I would like to, because I did this series called Where Are the Designers? And we also got Harish, the head of design at Cred, to the talk. And me and Abhineet, the co-host for that series, used to keep talking about this same thing because, there is form, function, all the cliche definitions, everything is, we are there. I understand. Now, where is the intricateness? Where is the cultural aspect of it? Where's the aesthetics of it? I think
because we can't shy away from eventually what are we crafting, right? Our intentions can be right, but remember, I think as designers, or at least some of us designers, still have the responsibility of also then being able to package those really great intentions and those really bright ideas into a form that is palatable and is receivable. Because Naito, all those things will only sit in our decks and our design conferences.
Absolutely. Yeah. So please,
So I think the way of dealing with really this sort of, complete sort of difference of aesthetics has mostly been by not jumping into aesthetics on day one, right? And I think there are a couple of reasons here, and why we usually tend to take a little bit of time while coming to a particular sort of genre or a space for a particular brand, right? So the first big one is actually of biases, right? Now, designers are human, clients are very human. And the reality is we will all have aesthetic biases based on, the lives we've all led up till this point, right? Where we went to school, where we lived, what kind of books we read, what kind of movies we saw. And what happens is generally, human beings, I think, have a lot of comfort in familiarity.
Absolutely.
Right. And I think that's where a lot of strong opinions, right, of what a particular space evokes or should evoke actually come from. They come from a lot of each of our personal sort of, associations.
In fact, I remember my upholstery is a typical pista and bottle green ke beech mein ka shade. And I remember that same shade, I bought it, but I had the same shade when I was probably 6th or 7th in my mom and dad's house, where I used to stay there, where I grew up. When I look at it, I clearly remember there's a connection. So
and it's interesting, right? Because that's a choice that you made for your home, right? Because again, Kedar at home needs something different, right? So but I think the very important thing that we are very, very conscious of, right, is the fact that none of these biases might be right for the brand that we are working with, right? We all might end up, jumping the gun and, choosing something that feels right. But often it feels right because it's something we're already familiar with, right? And that's my worry with trends sometimes, right? When one sort of jumps onto a trend, is, there are trends because they are trends, we are seeing them a lot. There's comfort and some meaning has already been attached to it. And therefore there's a ready-made answer. So why not quickly solve it? Why wait? So I think that's sort of one danger of jumping into aesthetics. The other little bit is, I think, category codes. Now, right now, to be really honest, if I go to a supermarket, or even if I'm shopping online, honestly, I can't make out one healthy cereal from the other, right? All sort of Ayurvedic skincare products sort of blend into this one, minimal, premium, thoda vaguely ancient India inspired kind of blur, right? And, if I take away the logo from, half the, let's say, the travel ads that I see, there's no way I can tell you what brand it is, right? So I think what happened is the success of some early brands, in different spaces, they built a very strong association for a particular category. And that sort of became the norm for everyone else sort of jumping into that space, right? Because they said, people already associate this with, I don't know, healthy or spiritual. So, let's also sort of work with it. There is a way to work with category codes, which I'll come to. But I just wanted to first sort of list down what the common sort of places are where, one tends to sort of drop the ball when working with aesthetics. The third is, I think, this sort of tunnel vision we all, develop. I feel sometimes because we are very, sincerely sort of engaged in the project, or, the founder is also very, very sort of passionate. So we all develop some kind of tunnel vision where we only think of aesthetics in the context of our brand or our category. But, aesthetics is quite complex, like you talked about that example of the upholstery you picked. I think we create associations based on multiple experiences in our life, right? And the user is also doing exactly that. So they're building these associations, not just ki biscuits mein kya ho raha hai. They're building these associations from everything else also in their life. So therefore, I think, what becomes interesting is that, my mental image, if someone told me ki what evokes safety for you, I'm going to think of many things. I'm going to think of healthcare mein kya experience tha, banking mein kya tha. And I think there is some sort of, and I've seen that, right? Like you look at alcohol and spirits today, right? And I think so much of it resonates with the luxury sort of things we see in travel or fashion that sort of have ended up in aesthetics in alcohol and spirits as well. So I think the reason to really step away from aesthetics on day one is to be able to think these three, at least, to these three things. And so that we don't sort of start with the easy answers. I think the critical thing for us always has been to, objectively arrive at goals for visual design with the client. I think this is very important, right? We can't, I think sometimes designers get frustrated because, they form this entire argument in their heads and then we go and throw a end product on the table. But I think it's very important, and it's really helped to take the client along in that journey. If they may not have necessarily seen their users' actual life, right? What the rest of their life looks like, what are the kind of fashion choices they're making. Even if, let's say, you're working with a fintech brand, right? You need to understand, because, those are the lenses through which you understand where does ambition lie, where does aspiration lie, where does apprehension lie, right? Similar thing, category codes also need to be read with some kind of analytical mindset. Like today, we've all understood that consumer research is never the answer. It's the ability to analyze it and then pull the insights out. So similarly, that's what we should do with category codes. Not look at a certain color and say, ye is category ka hai. No, I think we need to understand why does it make people feel a certain way about that sort of, space. And once we sort of understand that, I think then we know what is it that we need to take. It may not necessarily be the same color or form or, I don't know, kinds of fonts, etc. So I think for us across whatever these 15, 16, 17 years, I think it's really, a lot of very, very deep engagement with, all three clients and their products and the users that have really sort of helped us find, slightly more specific aesthetic decisions. These are not solutions that I think one is going to find in a mood board, because I think sometimes they don't exist on a mood board, no?
Yeah, true.
तो नहीं कर सकते हैं. Like a lot of the times, people have asked, so like next step, you will show us a mood board. And, sometimes you have to say, no, I can't show you a mood board because I don't know. But you know what? I'm going to show you what their playlist looks like, right? And let's try and understand from that. So I think across different projects, these aesthetic decisions have come from very different places. which can be, I don't know, for, let's say, for Royal Enfield rebranding, a significant part of that first phase of design was not spent designing, but just sort of understanding the motorcycle started essentially in post-war Britain, right? And there was a certain amount of restraint because of wartime, right? And that sort of became very, very peculiar about British design from not just that era, but that sort of continued, that sort of very elegant minimalism, right? Where there is ornamentation, but with a lot of control. And if you understand that brand of craftsmanship, then one is sort of able to design for this brand, which really sort of is British design, right? We might say, hamara hai, but it is the core of the design aesthetic of the brand is post-war Britain, right? So a lot of time was spent understanding that. And I feel a lot of the sensibilities that therefore sort of came to fore, not just sort of that first year of the big sort of, brand launch, and we've continued to sort of work with them on, key new projects, has been that understanding of the provenance, right? And the philosophy and why things were like that, why does it not have the American swagger, or why does it not have, the Japanese sort of stance, right? In their products, in their communication. So for instance, in Royal Enfield, it came from understanding their history. In Wildcraft, it's really just, there is this irregular sort of crazy brushstroke that you see everywhere, right? Which essentially came from, listening to their, their experiences in the field, talking to people about why they liked to go hiking or trekking or camping. And I think in one of those interviews, someone had said this, that it feels very raw, right? And that I think is beautiful, right? Because that's something nature does to you, right? It's a little bit outside of your control, right? It has its own mind, right? So the aesthetic decision of that sort of wild brushstroke for Wildcraft comes from there. We, currently, I think very recently, we'd worked with Tarun Tahiliani and the Aditya Birla Group. So, they've of course, there's a new joint venture, and they've launched a brand called Tasva, right? Which is a ethnic Indian menswear, right? Now, one route for it could have been to say, yeah, what is ethnic Indian celebration? And let's sort of dive into that, right? But when you understand the business rationale of that brand, right? If you look at ethnic menswear in India, and I'm talking about mass segment, okay? So I'm not talking about very premium. So the mass segment is essentially not really led by any particular design sensibility, right? It's a little bit of like knockoffs of here, there, but it's largely very, very undifferentiated. But when you take a Tarun Tahiliani, right, and you make him accessible, then that design leadership is your strongest asset. So very, very strategically, if you look at, and this is very recent, so you may not have yet seen it, but it actually feels so much like Tarun and his work, right? And that was important, that this brand should not invent its own complete sort of metaphors and expressions of celebration, but it had to be a translation of what Tarun brings to the brand, right? Because he's the big strategic asset here. So Abhi, ET Money just launched, right? And I don't know if you've heard the Sonic logo. You hear it when you launch the app or at the end of the ads, etc. So the Sonic is interesting, where we said, so one of the key propositions is, what it does is it replaces the idea of this, very wise wealth manager who is a person with very, very wise, intelligent and dynamic tech, right? So very strategically, the sound is very digital. It's very obviously digital, but it somewhere reminds you of coins, right? So there is this little bit of a digital intelligence that you build in, versus, let's say, a PhonePe, which is also a fintech brand, but that was much more human construct, right? So there, the Sonic identity is very, very human. So I think there's really no one way, right? And I think acknowledging that early in the day has sort of helped us to say, hame nahi pata. I think just starting with that blank slate is great. I think just engaging deeply has really helped. And it's helped us shed our biases, right? I think the magical bit happens is when you realize, what do you need to prioritize? What do you need to leverage? Because it's not going to exist. I don't think the answer exists. And ideally, it shouldn't exist, right? Because that's where you sort of create a unique space. But you really have to feel it in your bones. I don't know how to explain it. You have to feel that building up of that space in your bones when you sit down on like a blank sort of a artboard or a canvas.
I think you have, well, you don't even need to tell this much, that feel in your bones, because I could sense it. I could, like, because the parallels, the examples that you gave me
Hmm.
sort of help me visualize that how this experience or how this exercise or this engagement unfolds as you go along. But yeah, really, really good sort of way to explain this. Cool. Want to conclude with one last question, which I'm sort of not very ready with the question yet, but it's just
Hmm.
like I'm sort of thinking aloud, and whatever
Hmm.
little bit of stuff that I've been reading or understanding, the Web 3.0, which is sort of called the creator economy,
Hmm.
what I've sort of tried to read between the lines and got a feeling that it's going to be very fragmented. And I'll give you an example. Today there are these board panda and whatever board ape kind of
Hmm.
stuff. Now they are
Hmm.
just going on a spree where people are just bidding crazy, and they start with some, I don't know, maybe with like 0.09 ethereum or something, and then go all up to like millions of dollars. Now when I started just pinging here a bit, and what I understood is you need to build a community, you need to build a fan
Yeah.
following, and then you keep riding that wave. And so it may not be like just one NFT, but like a entire
Yeah.
FOMO generating, like a bouquet of sort of gifs and artworks.
Yeah.
So I'm just speculating कि आगे चल के these individual designers will be almost like individual brands. So you have given any thought, any wild thinking about it? Is it going to be tough to brand yourself as opposed to branding as an individual versus like an organization? Any thoughts there? Just like thinking aloud.
So, sorry, I didn't get the bit about branding yourself as an individual versus organization.
Yeah, as in like these NFT artists are single people, right? Now
Hmm.
they're brand themselves almost like a
Hmm.
single brand or whatever, that solopreneur kind of a
Hmm.
thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Versus so the long tail will be huge, and these corporates, these big companies might not even, uh, I don't know how to put it. There are these big organizations, and there are these cool, even in Web 2.0, there are these D2C brands which are making an impact
Hmm.
through their brand.
Yeah.
So any thoughts around that? Ki what is going to be like, any future that you see? क्या होने वाला है brand
I
में?
think one of the things, and I think we've already honestly started to see that happen, right? I think scale is not going to solve things for you necessarily, right? If you remember, if we were having this conversation, I don't know, 10, 12 years back, it would feel like if you're already a big organization, that things are smoother for you, right? Um, I, I feel scale is going to become more and more irrelevant. I think the interesting thing is going to be the battle for mind space, because that is essentially going to be about ideas, right? And that's where, whether you're a brand or you're a small organization or you're a single person entrepreneur, one creative artist, I think a lot of that is going to slowly, not slowly also, I think we're seeing it quite rapidly only happen. I think more and more now, and I think it's also part of the fact that life in some sense has become a little bit difficult, right? And we're, I think, only now beginning to understand what some of the ramifications of the last 2 years have been. I think people are going to be, if not by choice, I think the world is right now forcing everybody to take a pause, become a little bit more mindful, whether it is about consumption or expression. So I think eventually people are going to start looking, not to become fans, right? But I think they would rather become part of something where they have a voice, where they can contribute. Which is why I keep saying, I think instead of saying consumer base, etc., let's start calling them as communities, right? This is your community. This is what you need to build. You don't need, fans is slightly crazy word, right? Because fan feels like blind sort of trust and blind love. And, it's very difficult for other people to take somebody who's very obviously biased as any sort of, voice of reason, right? You look at, I think, a lot of, I feel like with a lot of the influencers that are sort of on right now, I think the ones who sort of do well, or one sort of goes back to see their content, are the ones who are a little bit more neutral, not neutral, but basically I think not so biased in terms of, being sort of open to sort of new ideas, exploring new things once in a while, saying that they actually don't know, but this seems interesting. So I think this entire sort of, new economy is going to run on the back of ideas that are led by values. And I think eventually, I think engagement is not just going to be to book eyeballs, right? It is going to be, people start sort of building stuff along with you, right? So I think that's from now. Again, I think we're all sort of trying to figure what this means. I think what is interesting is also the richer sort of immersive experiences that, Web 3.0 is going to provide. And I think it will be interesting to see how sort of, brands and sort of people move in. Because while everything is virtual, I think it's weird, right? Because the desire still remains to connect as people or to connect with people. So I think, I think that will be interesting. Completely uncontrollable, which is going to be interesting to see.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Cool. No, I mean, yeah, it's quite going to be a pride to see, and I'm very happy that we are sort of looking at this generation where we are at the cusp of entering a metaverse. So let's see what happens there as well.
Yeah.
In fact, I don't know. We are maybe. Yeah, cool. So thanks a lot, Mohor, for giving your time. It was really wonderful talking to you. And I hope you I wish you best of luck in the next gigs that you pick up. Any existing work which you guys are working on?
No, I can never talk about. That's the only problem with working with branding. Is you're the most boring dinner time guest because they tell you what's happening and you're just like, nope, no can say. But I think it is interesting this year. I always keep thinking, and I think the biggest fear when you run a practice for a while is that, will things plateau, right? Will things start becoming repetitive? Mm-hmm. But I think every year, and again, this year is the same, it just surprises by throwing completely new segments, completely new businesses, completely new sort of audience segments. So I'm very excited about this year. And of course, all of you'll only see stuff in like a year or so. But I think it's interesting. I think very long back, this is 10, 12 years back. We were still struggling as whatever the little practice that actually we've always remained. And I remember telling this, colleague Siddharth saying that, man, I want to do, like, I want to see our work everywhere. And at that point, it just felt like it wouldn't happen. And now it's just so exciting. But I creep people out on the road if I see them with like a Wildcraft bag or, or a Royal Enfield bike by just like grinning at them like a maniac. Yeah. So it's been interesting because I think when we started, a lot of people said, if you want to do big stuff, you can't work in this sort of very boutique sort of fashion and this sort of crazy level of engagement. But I'm glad. I think the industry sort of changed at the same time. So we were all very lucky. The fact that people find value in sort of engaging in a particular way, which is not sort of the standard process where, they're okay if you walk in and say, listen, guys, we don't know, but let's solve this. Right? So we found some more people like that this year. So I'm great. So hopefully we're going to be exploring new things.
Yeah, definitely. No, I mean, there are two sides. Definitely the brands have started engaging at that level, but it's also sort of the hard work, the perseverance, these like your sort of agencies are at it to improve the design standards of Indian products, Indian brands. So yeah, I mean, there's also like you can you
and
need not.
It's absolutely selfish, right? I think because I feel the more kind of examples we can put out as sort of successful, sustainable business or design or experience cases, I think it helps all of us back, right? So I think it's as sort of selfish a motive.
Yeah, no. Cool. Okay, thanks a lot. And that's it from today's GAN session. For show notes and more GAN, visit audiogan.com. If you like this podcast, please don't forget to check our other interesting podcast on IVM Network. You can listen to us on IVM Podcast app, ivmpodcast.com, or any of your favorite podcasting apps. To stay tuned, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IVM Podcast. And if you wish to connect with me, I'm at AudioGAN Moments on Instagram. Until then, take care.
Hello! It's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On This Round is on Me, Gauri is joined by Shweta Nanda. They talk about the financial independence and how it is to be a woman entrepreneur. On Anish Thing, Anish welcomes ultra-marathon runner Shivani Gharat. Shivani shares her journey of how she ran her first marathon, the mindset of a runner, and what it actually takes to run a full marathon. On Cock and Bull, Cyrus, Naveen, Akash and Shreyas talk about the Korean band BTS serving in the military and its repercussions. On Think Fast, Varun and Suchita discuss Wing Greens and their latest acquisitions and about the Indian sexual wellness market. And on Shunya One, Sheila Datya is joined by Dinika Bhatia, CEO and founder of Nuttigritties. They talk about coming from a business family and Dinika's journey in creating healthy and guilt-free snacking. Once again, don't forget to visit our merch store on ivmpodcast.com. We have some exciting new merch out there for you. Also, do follow us on social media. We are IVM Podcasts on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And do remember to spread the word about these shows and any other shows you might be listening to. Appreciate them, rate them, and review them wherever you are listening to them. You can also check out all our other shows on youtube.com/IVM Podcasts. And finally, we would like to thank our sponsors this week. Volvo XC40 Recharge, Bumble, Heads Up for Tails, Kotak Privy League Program, and HDFC Mutual Fund. Thanks guys, without you this would not be possible.
Do you often find yourself surrounded by conversations about Web3, blockchain, NFTs, DAOs? What are these terms and how do they affect our future on the internet? So many questions, but don't worry, we've got answers to all your questions. Hi, I'm Eklavya Bhattacharya, and on our show Future Proofing, we try to decode the impact of these future technologies on various industries with experts and tech enthusiasts. Tune into new episodes coming out every Thursday on the IVM Podcast app and the website, or wherever you get your podcasts from.